If you want to get the best quality shots with your DJI Neo, there are some settings that you need to change right now. And I've put all of the settings from this video into a PDF checklist that you can download for free. Link is in the description. Now, there are 3 different ways that you can fly the Neo, and they each have a different set of settings that you can change. You can just fly it on its own, launch it from your hand, or connect it to your phone. You can also connect it to a dedicated remote controller. And finally, you can fly it with the FPV goggles. So starting with just flying the Neo on its own or with your phone, there aren't a ton of settings that you can actually change, but there are some that are really important. So to change these settings, you'll connect to the Neo with your phone, and then you'll go into settings to video. First of all, you want to make sure that it's set to 4K. The quality in 4K is going to be way better than in 1080p. So make sure to always shoot in 4K with the Neo. And then frame rate, the only option that is available in 4K is 30 frames per second, so that's what you'll want to choose. Then the third setting is encoding. You can either choose H.264 or H.265. H.265 will give you somewhat higher quality for the same file sizes, but older computers may struggle to play it back. So if you're having a hard time playing back H.265 footage, you can set this to H.264. Now you can also change settings for photos. Really, the only setting to change here is to switch from 16:9 to 4:3 aspect ratio, which will use the full height of the Neo's sensor. And then under app recording, you can record audio in the app to go with your Neo videos. This can be good if you're vlogging with the Neo or something like that. Now, when you're flying the Neo on its own or with a phone without a dedicated remote, there's no real exposure settings or sharpness settings, which is kind of unfortunate. It'd be great to be able to change those things, but there are a couple of workarounds. First of all, if you want to get a slower shutter speed in bright light for natural motion blur, you can use ND filters, which are just little dark glass filters that clip onto the Neo's camera and cut down the amount of light that's coming in, so you can use a slower shutter speed and get that nice creamy motion blur. Freewell sent some of these to me, and I use Freewell filters all the time, even when they don't send them to me. I'll link those down in the description. Usually in bright sun, an ND16 is going to be a good option. In less bright conditions, an ND8 can work, and make sure in lower light to take off the ND entirely so that the ISO doesn't get bumped up unnecessarily. Now, there is kind of one little problem with ND filters on the Neo, and that is because it doesn't have a 3-axis gimbal and it's just electronically stabilizing the footage. If you slow your shutter speed down and have motion blur, when that motion is taken out, your frame can just blur momentarily, and that really doesn't look good. For tracking shots, this isn't going to be so much of a problem, and they are definitely going to look better with some motion blur, especially if you're going relatively fast. But for most of the other automated flight modes on the Neo, I can't really recommend ND filters because of the stabilization blurring issue. Now, the footage out of the Neo is by default kind of over sharpened, looks overly crunchy, and unfortunately there's no way to adjust that sharpness when you're flying it with your phone. But I do have a bit of a post-processing hack that can make it somewhat better, and I'll put a link to the video where I show how to do that down in the description. So those are all the settings for flying the Neo from your phone. Now moving on to the settings that you have available when you're flying it with a dedicated remote like the RCN3 or DJI RC2. So the first thing you'll want to do is tap down in the lower right hand corner where it says auto, click on that, and it will switch to pro so that we can adjust all of our camera settings. So the first thing we'll want to set is our exposure settings. Now by default, it will be set to auto exposure, where the drone will control the shutter speed and ISO automatically. And this can work if you're in a hurry, but it's not ideal because you have no control over what settings the drone decides to use, and the exposure can change during a shot, which usually doesn't look great. Now, if you want to go with auto exposure, you can click on auto by shutter speed and ISO, and then you'll just adjust the brightness using the EV slider underneath. But most of the time we'll want to control these settings manually for the best results, so you can just tap next to ISO and shutter to switch off auto mode so that we have full manual control. So the 2 exposure settings that we have available are ISO and shutter speed. First of all, ISO, you'll want to have your ISO set as low as possible. I keep it set to ISO 190% of the time. In low light, light, you will have to bump this up to get a bright enough image, but the higher you go, the worse the quality gets and the more noise and graininess you'll have, and anything above ISO 400 is going to be pretty terrible. Next, you'll want to use the shutter speed to adjust the brightness of your shot. Now ideally, as I mentioned before, for the most natural motion blur, you'll want to follow what's called the 180-degree shutter rule and set the shutter speed to double the frame rate. So for 30 frames per second, that would be 1/60th of a second. But most of the time, setting your shutter speed this low will make your footage way too bright. And to fix that, you'll need to use ND filters that, again, as I mentioned, they attach to the camera's lens and cut down the amount of light that comes in. Now, again, there is a little bit of an issue with using those on the Neo in that it is trying to stabilize out all the little jitters electronically instead of mechanically. So with ND filters, it can kind of cause some blurring. This isn't going to be so much of a problem if you're just flying forwards and backwards, but if you're trying to fly sideways and do like a parallax shot around something, you can definitely run into issues, especially in more windy conditions. So 180-degree shutter speed and ND filters for the Neo, they can be good in certain situations, but a lot of the time it's just not going to be worth the hassle of using them. So now that we have our exposure settings set, we can click over into the second settings tab on the left where we can see all the rest of our settings. First up, we have white balance, which is basically how warm or cool the shot is. Now you could just leave it set to auto and it will do a decent job a lot of the time, but it can change during a shot and sometimes it simply gets it wrong. So I'd recommend that you turn it off auto and set the white balance manually. If it's sunny, you'll want to set the white balance to around 5,600. If it's cloudy, you'll want it on up around 6,300. And at sunrise and sunset, I like to have it around 5,600 or a bit higher to make sure you get nice and warm colors. And sometimes if I want to set the white balance very quickly, I'll just click it to auto and let it set it, and then click it back to manual to lock it in. And often that will look decent without any extra adjustment. And then next we have resolution and frame rate. Again, you'll want to set the resolution as high as possible, so that would be 4K. 1080 does not look very good. Again, you are limited to 30 frames per second, so that's what you'll want to choose. And again, same thing here, H.265 is what I'd recommend, but H.264 can work fine if your computer struggles with H.265. So then diving into the settings, first we'll go to the control tab, and there's a lot of settings here, but we're going to focus on the ones that are important for getting better footage, which are the gain and expo tuning settings. Here we have settings for how the drone responds to your inputs in Cine, normal, and sport modes. So for Cine, I just leave all the settings at default. I don't really use Cine a whole lot, and for when I do, the default settings are fine. In normal mode, I have max horizontal ascent and descent speeds all set to the max angular velocity, which is how fast the drone turns, set to 75 degrees a second, and the expo settings I set to 0.25 for up and down, 0.15 for yaw, and 0.2 for pitch and roll. And then under gimbal, we have the max tilt speed set to 15 degrees a second and smoothness set to 10. And then for sport mode, the max horizontal ascent and descent are all at the max, and then max angular velocity is set to 120 degrees a second, and then under expo, up and down is set to 0.3, yaw is set to 0.15, and pitch roll is set to 0.25. And under gimbal, max speed is at 20 degrees a second and smoothness is at 15. Now, these aren't the only settings that can work well. You can do your own testing and figure out what settings work best for how you fly, but these are the settings that I've found to give the best results. And then moving over into the camera tab in settings, a lot of the settings here we've already looked at on the home screen under the camera settings there, but there are a few more settings that we need to change. First of all, you'll want to enable the histogram, which helps you judge your exposure. In short, you'll want to have the mountain of data sitting in the middle of the histogram, which means you aren't losing data in either the highlights or the shadows. If you have the mountain all bunched up against the right side, it means your exposure is too bright, and if it's all bunched up on the left, it means it's too dark. And then I always have the thirds grid lines and center marker turned on. The thirds lines help you compose your shots according to the rule of thirds. Basically, you want to put important parts of your image, like the horizon or a subject, on one of those horizontal or vertical thirds lines. And the center marker is helpful if you want to precisely center something in the frame or even just see exactly where you're headed. And then we have sharpness and noise reduction settings under style. These are some of the most important settings that you can change on the remote. You want to turn sharpness down to -2 and noise reduction down to -1 to keep from having that over sharpened, over processed, cheap camera look. Now, if you're flying the Neo as an FPV drone with the Goggles 3 or the Goggles N3, there are some other settings to set. First of all, if you use the joystick to click up from the bottom, you can set most of the camera settings here. Your ISO is going to be the same, keep it at ISO 100. Shutter speed is going to be the same. This is where it actually makes more of a difference to have ND filters because you're flying very quickly past things. There's a lot of motion in the shot, and so using a shutter speed of double the frame rate and getting natural motion blur will make the most difference here. So if you're flying the Neo and trying to get cinematic FPV shots with it, I definitely would use the ND filters here. And white balance, same thing, same settings as on the remote, but it's even more important to set it manually for FPV because it really tends to do weird things if it's set to auto. Then moving on over to aspect ratio, you can either set this to 16:9 or 4:3. I usually prefer the 4:3 aspect ratio for its larger vertical field of view when you're flying, and also so you can take out vertical crops for social media posts, but you do lose the ability to have the built-in rock steady stabilization turned on in the drone, and you can only stabilize the footage in post with gyroflow if you're using the vertical 4:3 mode. So for most people, it's probably going to be better to just stick to 16:9. Again, you'll want to stick to 4K at 30 frames per second for the best footage. For a while, I had the Neo set to 1080 at 60 frames per second because it would give a higher frame rate feed to the goggles, so it's smoother and less jittery, and you can actually fly better with that 60 frames per second feed. But the footage out of the Neo at 1080 is again just really bad quality. So if you want to get good shots, I would stick to 4K 30. If you just want to fly for fun and don't care about how the footage out of the drone looks, stick to 1080 at 60 frames per second for smoother feed to the goggles, but otherwise stick to 4K 30. And then under stabilization in 4:3 aspect ratio, again, it won't stabilize the footage at all. It's just going to embed gyro data in the files, which you can then stabilize in post in a free app called Gyroflow, which does work pretty well, but it's an extra step. In 16:9 aspect ratio, you can choose either rock steady image stabilization or horizon balancing. Rock steady is the default stabilization method that just smooths out all the little jitters, whereas horizon balancing is going to try to keep your horizon level, and so it crops into the shot more. If you're flying FPV, you kind of want the horizon to tilt anyway, so I would never really use horizon balancing. I would stick to rock steady if you're using internal stabilization. Now on other drones, I do recommend to shoot with stabilization off in the drone and just stabilize it in post, but for the Neo, I don't think that the tiny advantage of post-processing stabilization in Gyroflow is worth it over the internal rock steady stabilization because the footage out of this drone isn't that high quality anyway, so all in all, just not really worth changing. And then finally, in the settings menu under camera advanced camera settings, you'll want to again turn down the sharpness to -2 and turn down the noise reduction to -1, and that will give you much better looking footage than with the default over sharpened settings. So there you have my best cinematic settings for the DJI Neo. You can click right here to see how to get the best shots with the automated flight modes on the Neo and all of my best automated flight mode settings. Make sure to get your free DJI Neo settings checklist down in the description, and if you want to learn even more about how to get cinematic shots with your drone, I have a completely free 45-minute drone filmmaking training where I share my top 10 secrets to getting the most cinematic shots with any camera drone. I cover everything from the best settings to how to get smooth shots to how to edit and color grade your videos. Again, completely free. Link to that is in the description. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more videos like it, and we'll see you in the next one.